Surrounded by supporters, Ron DeSantis claimed a victory in the culture war, signing into law a bill to block Florida's public colleges from using government funding on programs supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes referred to as DEI. It's only the latest in a series of controversial moves by the Florida governor. He recently signed into law restrictions on teachers discussing sexual orientation and gender identity through senior year of high school.
Advocates are now warning that the recent spate of legislation is threatening to negate progress. More than 340 anti-LGBTQ laws have been introduced in state legislatures around the nation. These laws range in limiting health care for transgender people, to bathroom bans, to prohibiting diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on campuses.
Hello and welcome to another episode of ERG PowerTalk. I'm your host, Joe Santana. Today's episode delves into a topic that has gained a significant amount of attention over the past year, and that is the backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion. As noted in that short clip we just played, state after state has been introducing anti-DEI legislation, and despite the progress made in addressing societal inequities following the tragic death of George Floyd, some companies are now turning their backs on these initiatives, and many others find themselves caught in the middle of this shifting landscape. The bad news for you is that a chilling impact comes from all of this in terms of the support that you get for your efforts. But the good news is that as leaders of underrepresented communities, you hold a unique position to address this backlash and drive positive societal and economic change. And that is what we're going to explore in this episode today. And to help us to do this, we have the perfect guest. But before we introduce our guest, let's take a moment to review our mission and acknowledge our supporters. This is ERG PowerTalk, and I'm your host, Joe Santana. ERG PowerTalk is your 21st century virtual forum for the exchange of great ideas and inspiration for ERG leaders, as well as others interested in supporting ERGs. With ERG PowerTalk, there is no more waiting until the next conference and praying that you get the budget to travel to the conference to find great ideas and stimulation. Just subscribe and listen to thought leaders at your convenience. Before we begin, a quick note of thanks to our supporters: Elastic, Dollar General, Freighter Health and Wisconsin Medical College, Hiscox, Mass Mutual, Manpower Group, Tapestry, Federal Reserve System, Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, MIT Lincoln Laboratory, Oshkosh Corporation, UL Solutions, and Sony Pictures Entertainment. Now, let's go straight to the program. He's an accomplished author and an expert in addressing this backlash. And in our conversation with him, we're going to explore the underlying reasons behind this resistance to DEI efforts and the strategies that resource group communities and their leaders can use to continue their efforts and to drive towards inclusivity.
Hi, I'm Jim Morris, and I'm the CEO of Jim Morris Consulting. I'm an inclusionist, facilitator, and author, and somebody who's really focused on helping organizations understand how to get everybody to the inclusion table, even especially those people who think they don't have a place at it.
Jim, I'm happy to have you here today. You and I have had several conversations before around related topics, so I'm sure that everybody's going to get a lot of value out of this. And for this episode, I want to introduce one more person, and that's my guest co-interviewer, Erica Fletcher. Erica is the Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Hiscox. Erica, thanks for joining us here today.
Glad to be here.
Jim, I'm just going to jump right into this, and right off the bat, I'm going to ask you why you wrote your book. Tell us the title of the book that you affectionately refer to as a long memo.
Well, thanks. And I want to just say, I'm so glad you're having this conversation. I'm working with CDOs all over the world who are spending a lot of energy right now understanding more about how to defend the work that they do, which is great, but it's also distracting them from the work that they're supposed to be doing, which is advancing the strategy of DEI inside their organization. So this is such a timely topic, and I'm super appreciative of having a chance to be part of it with you. So I wrote the book in July of last year, as a result of finding out that there was a book, actually a field guide, they called it, that was about how to disrupt school board meetings and to change school curriculum by disputing the validity of critical race theory. So there was a whole movement to try and undermine teaching the real history of enslavement and civil rights and discrimination in the United States by claiming critical race theory was to blame for it as some sort of Marxist strategy to, kind of part of the replacement theory thing. So when I found out about the field guide, and then I started looking around for, has anybody written the actual truth about what these topics mean and what the subjects really are about? And I couldn't find anything, so I wrote a field guide, kind of a counter to it, just as not as trying to take a partisan stance, but just to explain what critical race theory actually means, why it matters, and why we need to preserve teaching the real history of whatever happens in any country around the world, so that our children can learn from what we've done, so they can do it differently and better.
And it's really a fascinating little book. I found that it's the counterhand book to the field guide that basically attacks critical race theory, and indirectly through that attack is really attacking DEI.
I'm actually in the process of writing a revision to the book, Gaslights and Dog Whistles, Standing Up to Facts Over Fiction in a Fearful and Divided World. I don't know yet whether or not it's going to be a new book or just a revision of the old book, because we've learned so much more about the strategy for how to do that, even in the 1 year since I created the book. And what I've learned has been all from people inside corporate DEI spaces who have been sharing with me their best practices around what they're doing to continue to focus on what needs to be done. So I'm super appreciative of that community for informing my thinking about it.
As an author myself, I know exactly what you're talking about, because you write a book and you think, okay, it contains everything and it is timely and it has all this stuff. And then a week later, you look at it and you say like, well, I didn't add this, right? Because things just keep evolving. So I hear you. So Jim, what do you think is the force behind this resistance? What is it that's driving it? I read something recently that I thought was really odd, and at the same time gives a little bit of a clue behind what the force is behind the resistance, which is that a lot of these groups, politicians and other people, are painting critical race theory, are painting woke, are painting DEI with this big broad brush that says it's anti-white. And if you look at this really carefully, as someone in this article that I read commented, the purpose of DEI is not to be anti-white, but actually to be able to get everyone in organizations and around the world effectively working together to create a more optimal world, economically as well as socially. So why do you think there are people out there that are driving this? What's the force behind it that's fueling it?
Great question. And there's so many answers to that. Let's start at the human level. Underneath all of it, my belief is, and there's a fair amount of research to support this, is that what's driving it is fear. Fear of loss of the opportunities and the privileges and the advantage that certain people have. Fear of change, fear of disruption of the status quo. And if we could just get to actually having a human discussion, a human to human discussion about those fears, we could probably do some problem solving. But instead, we don't get vulnerable. We don't tell the truth about what we're afraid of. And we start making accusations based on what, the soundbite that we've heard that's clever and interesting that really doesn't get to the point. So I think at that level, what's going on is fear. At a bigger level, I think what's happening is, and some of this backlash, I think, is really about shame. And the shame is a term, as a cisgendered, straight, white guy, I wasn't acculturated to talk about shame. I was acculturated to do something, to go to action, to solve problems. And I knew what humiliation was. I knew what embarrassment was, but I didn't know what shame was. And I think shame's what's behind some of this. And here's why. most of us have an experience where we've seen somebody be discriminated against or marginalized or harassed or treated badly, and we didn't say something. Almost all of us can refer back to a time when that's happened. And I think we go through a period of kind of self-judgment about, oh, I should have said something. I should have done something. And now we take DEI and we say DEI is really important. And we start talking to that same audience about why DEI is important. And instead of going, great, this will be a chance for me to learn how to do it differently, we hearken back to the times where we didn't take action, where we have a judgment about ourselves for not making movement on something, by not responding and being an effective bystander in the moment. And we say to ourselves, okay, we're going to talk about DEI. This is going to hurt. So we put up our shield to protect ourselves from going into those difficult conversations where maybe we didn't even do what we knew we needed to do. The other part about the shame argument to me that's important is I think there are DEI practitioners who, with the best of intentions, have gone into audiences to work with them, and they've used shame and they've used guilt as a attempt and a motivator to help the audience understand the situation. We all know, anybody who's been a parent, anybody who's been a teacher, we all know that shame ultimately is a terrible motivational method. So I think there are people who legitimately have a concern about DEI training because they've been involved in some DEI training that, instead of drawing the audience in, sent the audience backwards.
Interesting. And one of the things that, as I was listening to, that I was recalling, I had another guest last season who spoke about the fact that most people like to think of themselves as being a good person. And if I'm a good person, then I do the right thing. I don't do all these awful things and so forth. And part of what you're saying is that the anti-DEI fuel, to some degree, is also a way of saying, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm self-justified. Right. It's all this other stuff out there. So it's protecting my self-image to myself as the good person, that I haven't done anything wrong, and that it's all this other stuff that's creating all this chaos. And then to your point, that there are people out there who, for whatever their reasons, wanted to use shame and wanted to use the idea of making people feel guilty as a way of motivating them. And that doesn't work. It doesn't engage people. If anything, it brings up their defensiveness. And at best, what it does is it just turns them off, and they are no longer really listening. They may be sitting in a room because they feel they have to, but they're not listening. So let me ask you this. We talked about the drivers being fear. We talked about the drivers being shame, and to some degree connected to this idea of protecting the ego by self-justification. So what strategies can resource group community leaders employ to continue to support their efforts towards inclusivity?
Yeah, great question. And I, of course, based on my work, I have a huge bias about this, which is that we've got to get the group of people who don't even think that DEI is for them at the table. We've got to get them involved, and not involved like, come be charitable and support these poor people from the ERGs. Not like that, because that's not helpful. Nobody needs sympathy. But from a stance of what I would call enlightened self-interest, like there's something in DEI for all of us. And the group that frequently, not just in the United States, but around the world, the groups that frequently have the least literacy about how DEI is helpful to them are the majority group members. They just don't see how there's anything that they can learn from or benefit from DEI in their lives personally, or in their professional lives, or as a business strategy. So, this is easy for me to say as a cis straight white guy, but I think one of the things ERG members can do is to continue to figure out strategies to involve those who are not involved, to invite them into the conversation, to get them to understand more about the lived experience of the people in that ERG, not so that they can feel sorry for them or sympathetic for them, or even to be an ally for them, but as a role model for everybody telling their own truth, talking about their own story. So that's my bias about it. Let's get, for the DEI members, let's get DEI organizations and ERGs, in my opinion, are doing a great job right now, almost better than any time since I've been. I don't know what you think, Joe, but almost better than any time since I've been in the work. ERGs seem to be more formed up and organized than I can remember, and I think that's great. And so let's put that to work. and engaging the people who are unengaged.
That's a great point. Interesting enough, a couple of years ago, I had the pleasure of working with a group of people who wanted to do a program on inclusivity that made everyone who was in the program aware of how inclusivity or the lack of inclusivity affected them. And we were sitting in that room, and there was a nice mix of people, men, women, white, Black, Asian, LGBTQ. I mean, it was just a nice cross-section of different demographics. And during that program, some of the questions that were presented were along the lines of what made them feel excluded. What were situations where they felt misunderstood? What were situations where they felt slighted, or they felt like they were not really engaged as fully as they could be by a team or in the organization? And some interesting things came up. I'll share one. One guy came up. He was a straight white male whose wife had a baby. And he said, I don't understand why people don't seem to realize that my wife having a baby is as important to me as a female, when a female goes off into maternity leave. And another guy, and I'm using them as an example because of the comment you just made before. And another guy said something interesting too. He said, I got a promotion, and it wasn't celebrated as much as if I had been, let's say, a person of color or a woman. It was just like, okay, so another white guy got a promotion. He goes, and I felt slighted by that, because prior to that, there had been other promotions and they were more highly celebrated, or they were touted a lot more. And those are some interesting comments. And then what happened was, when everyone came together and shared all of these different things, and then we talked about what steps you could take to be more included in an organization, to be more supported, those men were really bought into this. They were talking about, well, how can I do this program with my direct reports? Is there a version of this that I can include in my all hands meeting? They were no longer just sitting there for the people of color or the women. They were there understanding that this has a lot to do with me too. And I think that speaks to your point, but that's just one example. What I'd love to hear from you is, in your experience, what are some other effective approaches for someone to use in order to overcome those barriers and to get people engaged, get them to see that this is not about me helping those poor other people. This is about me doing something that helps the world, and me being part of it helps me and my family and those I care about as well.
Yeah. While you were talking, I was listening to your story, and I was thinking that there's another thing I think that we can do at an organizational level to help overcome some of the resistance. And that is to not get bound on our own language. Like DEI is now this term that everybody uses all over the place. A colleague of mine, Jorge Casada, who's the CDO of Granite Construction, big construction company, they're focusing on inclusive diversity. And those are the only two terms they use, inclusive diversity. And the reason is DEI in so many circles now has some sort of stigma associated with it. And Jorge didn't want to do away with the terms and pretend they didn't exist, but he also was aware of his audience. And his audience very much, Joe, there's an awful lot of people in that audience, in that organization, who are all about inclusion, but they sometimes feel left out of the story about what's true for them, right? So inclusive diversity to them was a way to kind of get there. So on the one hand, we don't want to hide behind, renaming everything that we do. But, some organizations, instead of using the term privilege, will use advantage or disadvantage as a way to just kind of help get past some of those trigger words. So that's important. The other thing I would say and I love your question about what can we do individually and how do we get there? And you mentioned this, Joe, and you named the strategy. I'm just going to reframe it a little bit, is everybody has an identity story. Everybody has a story of where they felt unseen or overlooked or marginalized or mistreated or stereotyped in a way that didn't feel fair. When I start doing work with groups, I always get everybody to express, to the degree that they're comfortable, what their identity story is, what's important to them, where do they come from. And incidentally, I call their identity story. It's like when I share with you my identity story, I'm sharing with you my operator's manual. What's important to me? What are those parts of my self that are critical to what you need to understand about me? Letting everybody describe their own identity story, to me, is a great way to try and get everybody on the same playing field. Not that everybody's had an equal experience, but now we've all had a chance to talk about our experience around being marginalized or overlooked or unseen for those parts of us that are important. That tends to neutralize a lot of the people who are sitting there saying, okay, here's another DEI thing, and I'm going to have to listen to how everybody else has had it hard and I've had it so easy. We've got to get past that, because everybody has a story. And if we're going to be inclusive, then we got to be able to hear everybody's story.
So as you were talking about appealing to people's common values and trying to get to a common language and really avoid some of those stigmatized words and phrases, et cetera, I think that is so important and so valuable. How can we, because what we're talking about is how do we remove those barriers, right? So that people can really connect with these concepts and really understand, so that they can do something positive and constructive with it, right? So that they can be successful, so that the company can be successful, et cetera. And could you talk a little bit more about that? What are some of the ways that, let's say, someone who is maybe earlier in their career as a DEI practitioner, and they're working with, the decision makers, right? Probably people who are more senior, who may not have had as much experience engaging with some of these concepts. And so they're new to the concepts. They're not feeling confident or comfortable. What are some ways that people can, as you said, how can we apply some of that common language so that we can really get to the meat of the matter?
Yeah, great question. And Erica, I'm sure there are people in the audience that have just as interesting answers as what I'm getting ready to say. But one of the things I think that we've got to do, and this is going to be almost impossible when you hear me say it, is we got to unhook from social media, right? At least the social media that we tend to get really activated by. Social media, to me, to some degree, and there's research that supports this, it thrives on our sense of outrage. Right. It finds the algorithm is set up so that when we spend a lot of time engaging in one kind of activity that sparks our moral outrage, it gives us more of those kind of activities. And now we're in a misinformation hole that is really, really hard to come out of. And because we're outraged, there's an endorphin around outrage that we tend to like. So we tend to want to stay in that. So one of the things, and again, this is what's so hard, is that we have to be choiceful about our use of social media, and we all need to be aware of what makes us outraged, because outrage is no place for partnership. We can't create partnership when we're in a place of outrage. And frankly, a lot of people who are in kind of my role and my position, who are sometimes are stereotyped as being liberal, are some of the biggest offenders about moral outrage. Is we think we've got the moral high ground, and we let everybody know about our superiority and how good we are and how silly and uninformed other people are. We are now othering a huge group of people that we need to somehow figure out how to be included. So to me, that's one thing. And the other thing that I'm noticing a lot of my colleagues who are DEI practitioners and organizations are doing is they're not worrying about the language their I would say their customers, who are usually more senior members in the organization. They don't worry as much about trying to help their customers change their language. They help their customers understand their own mindsets. It's awfully easy to say, well, let me explain to you what an ally is, and let me explain the real term of what diversity means and what the definition of inclusion is. And so we end up in a kind of an education mode, which is understandable. But the real work, I think, for people who are not engaged that DEI practitioners can help with is get people to examine their own mindsets and their own beliefs. And one of the ways to do that is by sharing their mindsets and their beliefs and their assumptions. There's this myth that some of us have that says that somebody who's big on DEI has no biases, that somebody who's a DEI practitioner is completely without any discriminatory behavior or any unconscious bias. Of course, we know, and I know that's not true. We have our own biases. We have our own unconscious biases. The difference is we have a practice to continually intervene on ourselves when we do it, right? I still do things that are sexist, even though I can't stand sexism. But I have a practice that teaches me how to repair it and how to own it so that I can keep on trying to get better. So when DEI practitioners can come from that space of being non-judgmental and open and helping their audience examine their own mindsets, I think that's when real change happens.
I love that. And I think it goes back to an old favorite Stephen Covey quote, which was, seek to understand before you seek to be understood, right? And that's really important, is to really seek to understand others and know that we're all in the same boat. We're all humans. As another good friend of mine, Howard Ross, who's been on the show a couple of times, likes to say at the end of the programs where he talks about bias, he says, you're biased, I'm biased, we're all biased. It's a human feature, right? It's not a glitch. We all have it, and we just have to know how to moderate it and how to work with it in order to make it work for us and not work against us. Okay, so here's what I got out of this first half of our discussion with Jim. 1, the resistance to DEI is driven by fear, particularly the fear of losing privilege, opportunities, and advantages. Shame also plays a role, with some fearing the implication of their past inactions. 2, to overcome barriers and resistance, it's essential to use language that does not trigger negative reactions. We need to adopt inclusive language that appeals to shared values between those like us and those unlike us. That is more effective than trying to force others to adopt our way of thinking and speaking. 3, to promote inclusivity and drive DEI initiatives, it's crucial to involve and engage people who may not initially see themselves as part of these efforts. This includes individuals from the majority group. 4, sharing personal identity stories and experiences can help people understand the impact of DEI on their lives and develop empathy, leading to more engagement and support for DEI initiatives. And finally, 5, you can help individuals examine their own biases, assumptions, and mindsets by creating a non-judgmental space for reflection and dialogue. Next, our discussion will turn to practical ideas you can use to drive the healing process and debate the forces that drive division. All this and more when we come back. But first, this. Are you an ERG group or committee chair struggling to balance your ERG activities with your day job responsibilities? Well, you're not alone. There are hundreds of thousands of passionate ERG leads all around the world that find themselves in the same boat. The only solution found by many is to give up lunch hours and personal time with family and friends. But there is a better way, and that better way is to master the powerful skills that enable you to 1, set realistic and achievable compelling goals and priorities. 2, distribute the workload by effectively delegating tasks and responsibilities to others. 3, communicate in a way that increases your impact with less time and effort on your part. 4, secure the full and active support of executive sponsors and other senior business leaders. And 5, fit your ERG leadership work into a reasonable set of time boundaries. And that and more is exactly what tens of thousands of your colleagues have learned to do effortlessly by participating in Supercharge Workshops. Supercharge Workshops was developed by us along the same easy and powerful how-to framework found in our popular Supercharge Your ERGs book. The modular, customizable programs are loaded with fun exercises and tools that will immediately give you back hours of time each day while increasing your ability to achieve high impact and measurable results in both your ERG work and your job. For more details on how you can schedule a Supercharge Workshop session in your organization, go to superchargeworkshops.com. That's https:// Supercharge Workshops, one word with no spaces.com. So don't suffer silently. Take that first step towards stopping your struggle today. Check out Supercharge Workshops. So, Jim, what have you seen work with some of your clients in terms of, in practical sense, what you've talked about look like? What have you seen organizations doing, whether they're DEI groups or they're community groups? What have you seen work in various organizations? I know that you've worked with a lot of different people, and I'm sure that you've seen quite a few different ways that these approaches are applied so that they work.
Well, of course, there's lots of ways, but one of the ways that comes up most recently for me is organizations who are taking their ERGs, or in some cases they call them like the diversity coalition. Maybe it's a smaller organization where they just have every one big kind of mashup of people to be part of their kind of underrepresented group coalition, is getting those groups and ERGs also in bigger organizations, but getting those groups to really pay attention to how to have dialogue with senior management. Because senior management frequently they're looking for, how do we make this strategy work? How do we apply this strategy? And the ERGs on the one hand are good at, I think, are one of the primary functions is for their members to support each other in the environment that they're in. But the other part of ERGs is to provide information, perspective, and advice to senior management. And I'm seeing more senior managers and more executive teams now saying, let's check with the ERGs. What do they think? And the ERGs are being asked to engage in business strategy now, which is beautiful and perfect. It's not just, and I don't want to minimize the moral argument for DEI. It's there, it's important, but we sometimes index on that without also understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, or whatever you want to call it, is probably one of the most important business strategies of our generation. So engaging ERG members and saying, what do you think? What's your advice? What are you noticing? What's the lived experience of the people in your group? That's really helpful. So that's one. The other thing I'm seeing that I'm awed by is there are some organizations, unfortunately the ones I'm working with I can't name, who their ERG members are actually actively involved in those states that are embattled right now about teaching the real history of enslavement and civil rights in the U.S. Those ERG members have been given latitude to become involved in school board meetings and state education department deliberations on what they're going to include and exclude from curricula. So all of a sudden we got ERGs and organizations that are engaged in their communities, standing up for continuing to teach the real history of what's happened, which is, it's basically literacy. So I love that. I love those organizations that have that kind of power and pull that are able to do that. And incidentally, a lot of those same organizations are the ones that have been targeted as saying, they're woke organizations and they have woke strategies, and they're being challenged. Most of those companies right now, their stock prices are going up, right? So, in spite of the attacks on those organizations, they're proving that DEI is an effective strategy, and you don't have to believe them, just look at their stock price.
Yeah, great point too, because I know that one of the things that I've learned working with a lot of ESG groups, environmental, social, and governance groups, is that the companies that are doing this work are actually doing very well for themselves in terms of their stock prices, in terms of generating revenue. And the companies that are on the fence a little bit and the companies that pull back, they're not doing as well as they could be doing. And the ones that buy wholesale into the regressive strategy, let's go anti-woke on everything and so forth, those companies aren't doing so well either in general. There might be one or two outliers, but generally speaking, they're not doing that well. So I write a number of articles and I interview a lot of people for articles I write for Fast Company and for Forbes. And the way that I've phrased it is that if you want to actually prepare your company to be able to compete and grow and be viable in the 21st century, you have to embrace what's emerging as the 21st century workforce, as well as the 21st century market. And it is not the market of the 1950s or the 20th century. It's quite different. And that's one of the big drivers for continuing to drive forward with this. And another thing that I find, and again, based on what you're saying, the evidence of stock prices moving up for companies that are doing this well is that those companies are doing well because they're listening to the signals. They're not listening to the noise. And the signals are the demographic changes, globalization, all these things are signals of where we're going. The noise is the politicians and the pundits and talking heads who actually make money off of creating that anger that you were talking about earlier.
Right.
But regular organizations do not make money by dividing people or by supporting positions that actually don't enable them to get the best people out of the emerging workforce or to sell their products and services to the emerging market. So, Jim, as you probably know, because you've talked to me a few times in the past and you've gotten to know me a bit, I've had a long career that way back also involved sales. So I've been involved in enterprise level sales. And one of the things that I always learned to be mindful of is make sure that you're clear on the benefit of the product that you're selling when you're talking to a customer, but also think about all the objections that they might bring up and be ready to respond to those objections. Objections are not bad. They're actually buy signals. They're telling you that the person is interested enough to want to know more. So as ERG leaders and others talk to executives or attempt to put into play some of the things that we're talking about, if they're successful in getting someone's attention, they're very likely to meet with objections, right? And those objections shouldn't be taken as they don't get it, they don't want to support this, but rather they are clear signals of interest. What are some of those objections that you can think of, and what are some of the ways that ERG leaders and DEI leaders can respond to those?
Well, one that just drives me nuts, but I can't, again, this is where I have to suspend my moral outrage, is when people say, I'm too busy already, I can't do this DEI thing. And I'm going, well, that's like saying you can't do safety. That's like saying you can't do customer service. It's like there's a mischaracterization about what DEI even is, as if it's something that's an ancillary activity versus a primary activity that drives business success. So to me, there's an opportunity here, and I call it persuasion. And persuasion is not, trying to convince somebody of something, but it's providing people with accurate information so they can make a different decision. I don't think I've ever sold anything. I just try and provide information about what I know is factually accurate so that the people I'm working with can make a different decision. All of us need to engage in the art of persuasion. We all need to stay involved in dialogue with each other. When I hear people now just kind of saying, forget it, he's unchangeable, he's beyond redemption, he's unhelpable, that's what scares the heck out of me, because that's the beginning of us losing democracy. Our democracy, our vote is the last step of a long process that should be about dialogue and persuasion. We've got to stay in the fire with each other, and we've got to keep talking to each other about those things we don't understand. I'm off topic a little from your question, which was really about what are some of the things that we hear. But one of them is I don't have enough time. We got time because if you understand the strategy, then it's not a matter of actually spending more energy. If you understand how to use DEI, in some cases, you can spend less energy for the same results. Another story that I hear, another myth, is that you're trying to change what makes us successful. You want us to let go of the fact that so many of our senior executives who are white men have been really part of our success, and you're telling us that we need to get rid of them and replace them. And nobody, of course, has ever said that. That's driven by a fear of change from the status quo. So we've got to reassure people. It's like we appreciate where we've been, and we've got to get ready for where we're going, right? Everybody loves change as long as they don't have to do it, right? And everybody, what's the expression? Everybody loves, Yeah. So anyway, so we've got to do that. We got to look at that and understand it. And the final thing for me is people will say, where's the data? Where's the data to show that we ought to be doing diversity, equity, and inclusion? My response almost always is, well, have you talked to the people that are part of marginalized groups in your organization? Because if you do, their stories of what their day-to-day lives are like is usually the data, right? So they're looking for some quantifiable check the box number that shows statistics, when sometimes the data actually is, one thing is, there's one thing to attract a diverse workforce. It's another thing to retain a diverse workforce. So is the organization keeping the people they're bringing in, or are they leaving because it's not an inclusive environment? What even if you're in your organization, you don't have a lot of underrepresented minorities, but you do have, almost every organization, for example, has women. Frequently, I start with, let's take a look at gender as a diversity dimension we've got to look at. And let's look at the delta between the experience of male employees and female employees. And guess what you find? Almost always, a numerically significant number of female employees have a story of feeling discriminated against, stereotyped, overlooked, overassumed, and marginalized in that organization, not on a monthly basis, but sometimes on a daily or multi times a day. So the data is right there. We just have to ask the question and listen with empathy.
Yeah. Great points. Those are the big ones. Time. What's the evidence that we have to do anything? Sometimes money, but that's all related. And I think that all of those things are things that when we are proposing changes or proposing efforts that we need to be aware of. We don't want to volunteer objections, but when they come up, you're ready to respond to them. And when you hear them, you don't hear them as, oh, that means that this person doesn't want to support me, or it means stop. It literally is a signal that they want more, that they're changeable, they're movable. They just aren't there yet. They might be maybe 80% there, and it's your job to help them get 100% there.
As always, Joe, every time I talk to you, I learn something new. And I love the term buy signal. And yeah, you're exactly right. And this gets back to my conversation about persuasion. Is when somebody is willing to engage with you about what they don't understand, that's a buy signal. That's an opportunity for partnership. They're not telling you you're wrong. They're telling you, I don't get it.
Exactly.
So that's the chance. That's the chance to really have a discussion and to be very, very tender with how you approach that. You don't want to trigger shame. You don't want to other them. You don't want to make them feel less than. Right? They're asking you a legitimate question. That's a vulnerability. So treat it as a gift. I love that. Buy signal. I'm on it.
So, one of the other things, Jim, that I wanted to ask you is this. A lot of times you'll hear people in organizations say, well, I have a couple of ideas where I could contribute, but, I'm not named the category, and that group is for that category. Or, for example, you might get a diversity officer that goes to someone in the organization and says, hey, you know what? It might be a good idea to talk to this ERG about this particular thing that you're trying to do because it affects that community, and they focus on that community. And the response that they'll get is, well, I don't know. Do they do that? Or is that, outside of what they do? I thought that was just a place where they all got together so that, it was like a home and hearth so that they could support each other and so forth. So my point is that there are a lot of people who believe that they know what these groups are for, and they may have a limited view of what these groups are for. They may have an idea that these groups are for some very small, limited outcome, when in reality, they're often an underused resource, a resource that can do so much more. And I'm also familiar with companies like the ones that you mentioned, where these groups are part and parcel of their marketing strategy. I've seen it in nonprofits. I've seen it in for-profits. I've seen them really have a tremendous impact on helping a company to expand its marketplace footprint, as well as being able to help support people in the organization who have come in so that the organization doesn't become become a revolving door for various demographics. So I've seen them do a lot of different things. And the groups that are doing it are really no sharper or more sophisticated than the groups in other companies where they say, oh, no, these groups just get together so that, so that everybody could feel good and so forth. So my question is, how can leaders of these groups and leaders in DEI help to expand that image in the organization or open up that aperture of how these groups are seen so that they can be leveraged and supported to their full potential as opposed to just for some narrow outcome? Yeah.
Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but you got to invite people to come see what the ERG is all about. And, one truth about human nature is in the absence of accurate information, we all fill in the gaps. We make assumptions. And those assumptions are usually driven by whatever fears most are prevalent for us. So, of course, if you were to really get some of the people who are part of the majority groups and organizations to say, what do you think the ERGs are for? Because they don't know, they'll sometimes say, well, I think it's mostly to talk about how they can replace them, how they can replace us with them, or like where they spend all their time figuring out how they can revolt against the power structure of the organization and re-represent who's in charge. Of course, that's not what ERGs are about. The solution to fear is information. The antibiotic that prevents infection is knowledge, is understanding. So how can we get members of other groups to come be part of the ERG, to see what we're about, to see what we're working on? And it's got to be more than just, explaining what your activities are for Black History Month or for Pride Week or for anything else. It's got to be about what's the ERG doing on a day-to-day basis, and make sure that people who come and visit get a chance to see the truth of how the ERG is a chance for people to get support from each other inside their own group, but also to help advance the objectives of the organization. And if the ERG doesn't have a compelling case for what they're doing to advance the objectives of the organization, I would submit they need to create that. They need to find that. They need to be offering value other than just making the people who are part of the group feel safer, which I think is enormously important. But they're not going to be safer if they don't have a job. And if they don't have a job, it might be because they haven't executed on a DEI strategy. So how do we get everybody involved in the strategy?
Great points. And one of the things that I often said about this topic as well is one of the fastest groups that I ever saw grow within an organization where I work was the LGBTQ group. And it wasn't called the LGBTQ group. It was called the LGBTQ plus. And that plus, as small as it might be, just a little plus sign, says a lot. The door is open to everyone. The focus is on LGBTQ, but you don't have to be LGBTQ to become a member. And I've often said to people, when you create these groups, be thoughtful about how you create the name or add a plus to the end of the name, because it's not difficult to see how, let's say, males in an organization might look at the women's network and think, oh, it's for women. It's only for women, or the Latinx group. Well, I'm not Latinx, so I guess I'm not invited, right? So you want to make it clear that while the focus of the group is a particular dimension of diversity, that the door is open to everyone. So I think that is along the lines of what you're talking about, which is make sure that you communicate that the door is open to everyone.
And don't be passive. Don't wait for somebody to come to your group. Create opportunities for people to be drawn into your group. You got to create, in marketing term, you got to create pull. You want people to be curious, and you want them to feel there's no barrier to getting involved, to be willing to come in. And again, what happens is we create artificial assumptions about the barriers. It's like, well, I can't go to that group. They won't be themselves if I'm there. And no, that's not the case at all. And incidentally, I love what you said about the names of ERGs. I've seen so many, and I'm sure you've seen even more, really creative names. One of my favorites is the LGBTQ plus group. They for a while went by the Pride group, and now they just call themselves the Plus group. Right? So the whole Because, I mean, LGBTQ is like you're taking a bunch of people with a bunch of different sexual orientations and genders and mashing them as if they're all in one big monolith. And of course they're not. So they just are like plus. They're plus. So yeah, I love that.
So Jim, inviting people to come along with you and making sure they know that they're not just included, but that you're seeking them out, that you really are trying to pull them in. One of the signals that I just think is so smart that I saw one of our ERGs do is it was our women's ERG, and they invited some of the men to be part of their leadership team, to be officers, right? Wow. And I just thought that was so ingenious, because that sends a very strong signal, right? They're not just welcome to attend a meeting. They really want their input, right? And they are part and parcel of what their ERG is all about. And I just thought that was, for them, it was a bold move and it was a smart move. What are some other examples of things that ERGs can do to pull those people in and really make it very explicitly clear that they are considered part of this, even when folks may feel, I'm not part of that ethnicity, or I don't have that background, or I haven't had the shared experience. How can we make it really explicit for them that they are absolutely a part of the success here?
Well, there's a lot in that, Erica, and it's a great question and also a great observation. So thank you for sharing what you're noticing. I love the idea of actually having people that can be officers that are not necessarily part of that group. That may work for some, it may not work for others. But two ideas come to mind for me. One is, in some organizations, they've actually created an ERG or a BRG that is about getting, and one of them, the name of the ERG is Engaging White Men's BRG. So it's a business research group for anybody who wants to figure out how to get more engagement from white men. Now I tried to get them to not use the term white men because I didn't want all the white guys to run for the doors. But so I like the idea of, let's engaging others BRG. So, getting people who are not at the table and keep it open without identifying any one group. Because again, one of the dynamics that, this is going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but one of the dynamics is when you're a member of the majority group, you're not used to being called a group. You don't have to be called a group. You get to be individuals. Nobody says to majority group members, what's it like being a white guy working in your organization, right? That's not stuff that comes up. Yet women frequently hear that, LGBTQ folks frequently, what's it like being here as a queer person? What's it like being here as a Latino? What's it like? So I never get that question. So the group status thing sometimes gets in the way. Anyway, so I think creating ERGs to get other people involved, and sometimes even meaning creating an ERG that anybody can be a member of to create more inclusion. That's one suggestion. The other one for me, it just gets back to this idea of mentoring. I don't know whether or not to call it mentoring or coaching or sponsoring, but every ERG member has an opportunity to mentor or sponsor somebody in their circle. So let's make sure that everybody in ERGs are equipped with the skills, I'm going to go back to the term, who are equipped with the skills of persuasion, which is not about convincing people. It's about giving people information so they can make an accurate decision, right? So how can ERG members learn to talk about their lived experience and learn to talk about what their needs and experiences in the organization in ways that draw other people in to be curious, to figure out how they can support and ally it? The final thing I'll say is I hope I don't get in trouble with this, but I think we have to be careful in how we use the term ally. I hear the thing that makes me uncomfortable is when I hear people like me saying, I'm an ally. I've been an ally to people for generations. I'm a really effective ally. Let me tell you all the things I've done that are good. Again, now we're back to defending our good guyness or our good personness. I never call myself an ally. That's a term that somebody who I work with who feels like I have their back gets to call me, right? So I think we have to be careful about trying to train people to become allies. Let's train people to understand what microaggressions look like. Let's train people to understand what systemic disadvantage looks like. Let's train people to understand how to overcome discrimination in the workplace. Those are ally skills. Let's train the skills and leave the naming to whoever is the beneficiary of that work. So I worry about allyship training sometimes because I think it sends a false message about what our work is.
So that's Jim Morris. I think that everybody got a lot of value out of listening to this conversation. And I highly recommend a copy of your book, Gaslights and Dog Whistles. Where can people get a copy of that book or any other resources that you recommend that can help them to advance this work?
So my book's on Amazon, and it's easy to find if you just go for Gaslights and Dog Whistles. Gaslights, I think, was the most popular term of 2022. So won't be too hard to find. I got that one right. There are a couple of other resources I think they're important. One is Lily Zing is an incredible thought leader and really good author, and she's written 2 books in the past 3 years. The first one was DEI Deconstructed, and the next one was DEI Reconstructed. Lily's brilliant. She's doing really good work. I'm also doing, I really love the work of Jackie Ferguson, who has a podcast called Beyond the Checkbox. I think that's great work. And then kind of in a different vein, a colleague of mine, Rand Miller, is an educator and an author, and he's a elementary and public school educator and teaches history. He has a website called randmiller.com, and he wrote a book called The Resistance Stories from Black History for Kids, inspiring people and events that every kid should know about. Now you're going to say to yourself, well, I'm an organizational leader. Why should I read this book? Well, this book incidentally is not, it's for everybody to understand more about the real history that if we're not careful, we're not going to be teaching our kids for long. And then finally, I'll say that the Inclusion Allies Coalition, you mentioned Howard Ross, he was a founder of it. The Inclusion Allies Coalition is, I think, probably at this point, the largest advocacy and education organization for DEI practitioners. And they can be found at inclusioncoalition.info. I'm a member and an active member in that organization trying to promote advocacy for DEI. So those are some resources.
Excellent. And Jim, how can our listeners reach you?
Jim Morris Consulting. Pretty easy. I'm the guy that's not the pitcher.
Fantastic. Jim, thank you again for joining us today on ERG Power Talk. And I also want to thank Erica for being my co-interviewer. Okay, so what did we learn from the second half of our discussion with Jim? 1, leverage your communities to collect valuable insights on what's working for your community and what could be better, and then share those insights with senior business leaders. Help them understand what is needed to create a more equitable and inclusive organization that is competitive in gaining and engaging 21st century workers and market share. Remember, when turnover costs go down and business grows, everyone across every dimension of diversity in the company will benefit. So make sure you communicate that value to everyone. 2, by your deeds and words, address common objections, including the perception that your ERGs are side of the desk, extracurricular, non-business centric activities. Define yourself as fully empowered to drive all manner of value to everyone in the organization, whether they are members of your community or not. 3, be inclusive. Invite everyone in the organization to join you and participate fully in your meetings and events. This creates opportunities for diverse groups to collaborate, share experiences, and share successes in a smaller, safe setting, which can then cascade out across the entire organization, versus only holding exclusive meetings with people who share your social characteristics and values, which often feeds fear and distrust on the part of those who are on the outside looking in. 4, in addition to looking for mentors and sponsors for yourself and your members, seek to be a mentor, coach, and sponsor in your company to individuals who are different from those who make up your core community. And finally, 5, instead of providing training teaching those in the majority on how to be your community's allies, provide them with the knowledge and opportunity to help your community and you to be their ally and advocate advocate to your community. Remember, allyship is not just a title some who consider themselves privileged can give themselves for helping those that are considered less powerful. It's a set of behaviors that we can all exercise toward each other across differences in power levels in an organization. So aspire to have everyone in your group be each other's allies, whether they share the social dimension the group was designed to support and leverage or not. In the final analysis, it all boils down to this. The resistance to our DEI endeavors and resource group communities stems primarily from fear, misunderstanding, and shame. And rather than responding with righteous indignation or the exclusion of those who fear you and don't understand you, or setting up artificial structures of allyship titles that do nothing but reinforce outdated status differences, the key to progress lies in all of us extending the hand of friendship, seeking to understand and support those who differ from us, and affording all the chance to truly get to know each other as equal members of the human family. As ERG leaders who set the objectives and the agenda for your groups, you possess a remarkable opportunity to be the builders of bridges within your organization. It's that deepening of our shared understanding that will serve as the healing balm to the fears and shame, and that will produce the powerful mortar that binds our hearts together across the expanse of our differences. Thank you for tuning in to ERG Power Talk. If you enjoyed and got value out of this program, please like us and leave a favorable review at your podcast provider's site. Also, invite others to listen to the show. By the way, contact me if you're looking for an ERG Symposium keynote or a leader for your strategy workshop, new chair onboarding, and or ERG bootcamp. I can run these for you either in person or in a virtual setting. Also, for more great ideas and tips for your ERGs, get my books, Supercharge Your ERGs, 18 Tips to Power Up Your ERG/BRG Strategy, and the new DEI and ERG Frontier, how you and your efforts can rise and thrive in the new world of constant disruption. Both available on Amazon.com. I'm Joe Santana. Thanks again for tuning in.